Cuba State Council has held an extraordinary session of the National Assembly of Popular Power to debate constitutional reform. The legislators will approve the commission responsible for drafting and presenting the draft constitution of the Republic, which would introduce changes to the 1976 Constitution. The initiative intends to update the Constitution without modifying the essence of the current political system. The president proposed that the first secretary of the Communist Party of Cuba, Raúl Castro, be the head of the commission. And Cuban President Miguel Díaz-Canel addressed the fundamental principles that should be adhered to by the future constitution, which he says must be endorsed by the people.
The committee has a fundamental mission to write a proposed draft constitution to the Republic in accordance with the principles of our socialist democracy, be subject to the broad popular consultation, making our people into a constituent body, and, after the analysis of the results by this assembly, in the exercise of their powers, submit the constitution to a referendum in which the nation can ratify the statements of the new constitution. It will take into account the humanist principles and social justice that configure our political system and consider as unmovable pillars of the socialist system that sovereignty adopted our people. It will take into account the humanist principles and social justice that configure our political system and consider as unmovable pillars of the socialist system that has been adopted by our people.
We thank you today. The numerous samples of solidarity received from all sides, both parliaments, parliamentary groups, friends or legislators that made themselves available in the midst of such sadness. We ask you to keep a minute of silence in tribute to all the victims, while we reiterate our condolences to their families.
Our Laura Prada has more from Havana.
The most important point on agenda today was the beginning of the work for the constitutional reform here in Cuba. Today was announced the 33 deputies that will be working in a commission to lead this work and to write this constitutional reform. Leading this group, leading this commission, will be the first secretary of the Communist Party of Cuba, Raúl Castro Ruz, the former president of the island. Together with the actual president, Miguel Díaz-Canel, both of them will be leading this commission that will implement the constitutional reform in Cuba. This constitutional reform, as we were talking today with some deputies, is not a separation from is not a difference from the socialist model of Cuba. It will not take distance from this process that is taking place, but it's going to include these new implementations of the Cuban economic model that have been taking place for a while, and today was analyzed. This weekend and on Monday will continue the work of this assembly, and parliamentaries will get more information on how this constitutional reform will take place, due to the fact that more than the half of this new parliament is new, and they must get in touch with the topic, with the information they have to process to give to the people when they inform them how this is going to take place. How long will take place this constitutional reform? Well, the time it needs to be consulted with all Cubans, and afterwards there will be a referendum in which Cubans will decide if they accept these proposals for the constitutional reform. We'll continue giving more information of what comes from these sessions of the National Parliament of Cuba.
We thank Laura for that report. Now, floods caused by heavy rains in Cuba after subtropical storm Alberto have left 7 dead and 2 missing, the Civil Defense said Saturday. Alberto has also forced thousands of evacuations and left considerable landslides in its wake. Alberto was the first subtropical storm in the Atlantic hurricane season. It struck the central provinces of Cuba with torrential rain last week, causing a bridge to break, infrastructural damage, and the collapse of the Cienfuegos refinery in the center of the country. The government had initially reported 4 deaths. In Puerto Rico, families of those killed in Hurricane Maria held a vigil in front of Puerto Rico's Capitol building in San Juan on Friday. They wanted to show just how many people had lost their lives compared to the official government figures. A new study by a group of Harvard researchers put the number of dead at almost 5,000. They believe most people died in the aftermath of the hurricane due to poor medical care.
This event is meant to dramatize the disconnect between the number that the government gave of those killed, of 64 killed during Hurricane Maria months after, and the Harvard study, and a few of the professors from here, from the University of Carlos Albizu, that found that 4,645 were killed, approximately, and that's a scientific number.
I'm
here to pay homage to all these victims, who the government, for the negligence, didn't want to count. And there are still more, because as I understand it, many of them were cremated and there are no records for them. These are friends and loved ones who have brought with them a pair of shoes worn by their loved ones to pay homage.
The Venezuelan government will overhaul the currency, removing 3 zeros from the bolivar on August 4th. The new date comes after President Maduro met with the Banking Association on Tuesday, and they told him the June 4th proposed date was too soon to get everything in order. The government communique urged financial institutions to prepare well for August 4th to facilitate the population's financial transactions and protect the currency. In an address on Friday, Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro, who's had a tumultuous relationship with the former Spanish Prime Minister, Mariano Rajoy, said he hoped there could be a better relationship between Spain and Venezuela now that there's a new Prime Minister. Maduro and Rajoy often sparred on several issues. Maduro often accused Rajoy of meddling in Venezuela's affairs. Rajoy, in turn, often accused the Venezuelan president of wrongfully detaining his political opponents. In 2014, Maduro ordered a review of all bilateral ties between the two nations.
Mariano Rajoy. Bueno, hoy en España hubo un proceso que respetamos.
Mariano Rajoy, today in Spain, there was a process which we respect. Mariano Rajoy has been ousted from the presidency of the government. He left. Let me tell you that this was the best moment in the relationship between Mariano and me. We were repairing our relationship. It wasn't idyllic, but it was better. That's why I was surprised he left so quickly, almost without saying goodbye. I respect Spain's politics and we don't get involved in Spain's politics. I hope the new government and the new president can construct a new vision about Venezuela and can open new policies of dialogue and respect on Venezuela.
Spanish socialist Pedro Sanchez was sworn in as Spain's new prime minister by King Felipe. Sanchez takes over after conservative leader Mariano Rajoy lost a no-confidence vote in the wake of a corruption scandal. The 46-year-old European lawmaker has never been in government. He is the country's 7th head of government since its return to democracy in the late 1970s.
I promise on my conscience and honor to loyally fulfill the responsibilities of Prime Minister and to be loyal to the King and to safeguard the Constitution, as well as to maintain secret the deliberation of the Cabinet.
Barbados' opposition leader has named his first senator. Details on that after the break. Stay with us.
My question is, I was told that independent experts would be at this panel. Mr. Kotler has been a lawyer for the right-wing coup leader Leopoldo Lopez, and he's also spent his career defending Israeli human rights crimes. He recently defended the shooting and killing of 62 protesters in the Gaza Strip, along with the shooting of thousands more. I heard the Secretary General refer to the OAS as a moral force. How can it claim to be a moral force, and how can this report not be considered compromised, considering the involvement of someone like Mr. Kotler, who defends human rights crimes by a U.S. ally while condemning them against a country where the U.S. is openly seeking regime change? And I also would ask about the independence of Mr. Canton. You've been affiliated with the National Democratic Institute, which is connected to the National Endowment for Democracy, which pays opposition groups in Venezuela, and cheered on the 2002 coup against Hugo Chavez. So can you please address your own independence? And Mr. Kotler, why did you support the shooting and killing of protesters in the Gaza Strip while condemning those in Venezuela?
I did not support massive killings with respect to Palestinians.
You blamed Palestinians.
I didn't interrupt you.
They responded with a non-answer, basically deflected. Mr. Canton said, I was only at the National Democratic Institute until 1998, and I'm proud of my work. And Kotler just said everything I said was false. Well, it wasn't false. Erwin Kotler took to Twitter to blame the government of the Gaza Strip for Israel's killing of 62 protesters in one day. He spent his whole career defending Israeli human rights crimes, and he is apparently a key member of not only this panel, but of the panel of the so-called experts that produced this report. Kotler also accused Venezuela's government of over 6,000 extrajudicial executions, and he said that Venezuela was responsible for the worst humanitarian crisis in Latin American history, in the whole history of Latin America. So I found that the panel was extremely propagandistic, and I didn't get a response to my question.
Welcome back. The new opposition leader in Barbados, Bishop Joseph Atherley, held a press conference earlier to explain his reasons for crossing the floor and to name one of the 2 senators he's entitled to choose as opposition leader. Bishop Atherley says democracy requires that he act in the greater interest of the country. He listed his reasons, which included his concern that the separation of powers was not being adhered to in a no-opposition parliament. But he reaffirmed that it had nothing to do with him joining any other political party. He said even though Prime Minister Motley wanted to amend the Constitution to allow for the DLP to appoint the opposition senators, he felt such an important act should not be left to a charitable act.
There's no repudiation of Barbados Labour Party platform or policy. I support them, especially as contained in the last manifesto generally. And it's not a rejection of the party or the leadership of the party. So there's no sense of rift in my spirit. Let me make it clear that I'm not joining any political.
Trade unionist Caswell Franklin will serve as an opposition senator. Franklin said he was very happy to serve.
I have been a voice in Barbados for a long time trying to make a difference, and sometimes I feel like giving up because nobody seems to be hearing. So I welcome the opportunity that Reverend Ali has given so that I will have a voice in Parliament to correct some of the things, or try to correct some of the things that I see as wrong.
The Organization of American States will meet with Nicaraguan authorities to review their electoral systems. The Nicaraguan Foreign Ministry reported through a communique, talks with the OAS will resume on Sunday. The letter doesn't say where or what time the talks will be held. It is expected that between July and October, the OAS will deploy a group of electoral law experts accompanied by the country's authorities, political parties, and civil society groups to Nicaragua. And on Friday, directors of the Nicaraguan Firefighters Association condemned groups of protesters who were blocking them and paramedics from doing their jobs. The firefighters also condemned acts of violence against them. One firefighter was shot in the back. They requested respect for the work that they do. Since protests began, there have been over 67 fires in public and private property. In 34 of the cases, the firefighters could not arrive in time to extinguish the flames.
Hemos sido atacados. We've been attacked with homemade weapons. On April 21st, 2018, one firefighter in the city of Masaya was shot dead by a homemade weapon.
Un jefe de bomberos, aquellas personas que dirigen.
Those people who are behind the road, blockades and violent attacks, please be a little responsible and let us firefighters do our job.
Que nosotros podamos hacer nuestro trabajo.
The final countdown before the elections continues in Mexico. Candidates visit different locations to carry their message, and the voters keep paying attention to the polls. Pablo Perez reports.
The candidate for the Morena party, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, continues to lead in the opinion polls, with 54% of preference and a 30-point lead over his closest rival.
There are prediction methods, and the polls are part of them.
During the election campaigns, different songs have been written by some musicians to help Mexicans to identify with their favorite candidate. The most recent one is being shared from one phone to another. Campaigning is also taking place on social networks, even in ways that are not totally legal, as this expert explains.
The social network platforms are not forced to say who's sharing fake posts, negative campaigns, and gossip.
But the main struggle is taking place in public places, where the candidates go on tour. José Antonio Meade, from the Revolutionary Institutional Party, talked about rural issues, just like José Manuel López Obrador did in Osaka.
Are we going to work for the Nayarita campesinos or not? Politics is a lot like the countryside. It needs support so that it can deliver on its promises.
We will produce in Mexico everything we consume. We need to strengthen production and create more jobs.
For the elections of 2018, 9 million new voters have been registered, increasing the total number to almost 90 million. Meanwhile, candidates are busy preparing for the third and last debate, which will take place on June 12th in Mérida, Yucatan.
Brazilian President Michel Temer appointed a new executive president to Petrobras on Friday, following the surprise resignation of Pedro Parente due to differences over fuel pricing policies. Parente was under fire for policies which resulted in a trucker strike that lasted almost 2 weeks. His replacement, Ivan Montero, was a finance manager and was previously a senior executive at Banco do Brasil. The Petrobras Board of Directors elected Montero as the interim executive chairman at a meeting on Friday, but Temer later recommended that he take office definitively.
I take this opportunity to reaffirm that my government maintains the commitment for recovery and financial health of the company, as we did over the last 2 years.
10 years have passed since the official launch of the Transitional Justice Commission in Ecuador. The commission to investigate crimes against humanity in the 80s unfortunately hasn't always provided families with the comfort they need. Denise Herrera reports.
Gustavo Garzón's brother, who was an Ecuadorian writer who disappeared on March 28, 1970, Rodrigo, for 48 years, has fought most of his life searching for answer into the circumstances in which his brother disappeared. But so far, no evidence has been found. Relatives believe it was a political disappearance.
We haven't even started assisting the victims' relatives in the legal process because the prosecutor's office hasn't opened a case. They are still investigating. We haven't made any progress.
Authorities of the Ombudsman's office, academics, students, victims, and relatives gather at the University Andina Simón Bolívar in Ecuador to discuss the decade since the Truth Commission was formed to investigate and try human rights violations during the administration of León Febres Cordero. In the 1980s, unfortunately, few cases have been prosecuted.
In Rodrigo Broja's administration, there was a police death squad called the FtS that persecuted, tortured, murdered, and disappeared young people. The police deleted all of the records related to the FtS, and even today, they are still denying the existence of this group.
The government has not done much to investigate the forced disappearances, which were allegedly mostly carried out by previous administrations. So the relatives of the victims have created an independent association to push the authorities into action.
debe continuar.
Life goes on, but it's important to keep demanding justice.
Earlier this year, Garzon's relatives received a report from the Inter-American Court on Human Rights, their first semblance of answers for the first time in 48 years. The report said irregularities were found in the investigations. According to them, their struggle will continue to ensure these crimes never occur in Ecuador again. Denise Herrera, Telesur Quito, Ecuador.
Time now for another break. News from around the world when we return. Welcome back. Let's have a look at some other stories making headlines around the world.
Riot police used tear gas to break up opposition supporters who had planned to march through Myanmar's capital, calling for transparency in next month's presidential elections. A spokesman for the Ministry of Security said 16 people were injured and taken to the hospital. One police officer was injured and 8 people were arrested.
We won't let this electoral farce they're preparing go on. They need to realize it won't go through. We will go to the streets. We will go everywhere to defend Malian democracy.
Thousands of people attended the funeral in Gaza for Palestinian nurse Razan al-Najjar, who was killed during protests along the border with Israel. Her body was wrapped in a Palestinian flag and carried through the streets on a stretcher by mourners. Her death brings the number of Palestinians killed to 119 in the weekly demonstrations that were launched on March 30th in the Gaza Strip. Protesters took to the streets of Paris to march in support of undocumented refugees and against a new asylum bill that is heading to the French Senate. The new law could speed up deportations for migrants who fail to obtain asylum in France.
Guyana celebrated its first Gay Pride Parade in the capital, Georgetown. The parade is the result of the work of the Guyana LGBT Coalition and signals the end of a week of activities to promote same-sex rights and queer tolerance in the Latin American country. Participants wore colorful costumes and danced to soca music in the streets. Now, church groups have come out in condemnation, but organizers say they're not trying to legalize same-sex marriage. Their only goal is to promote awareness. Many countries and organizations recognize June as Gay Pride Month. And we've come to the end of this news brief. For these and many other stories, you can find them on our website at telesurtv.net/English. And join us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. For Telesia English, I'm Sonny Gray. Thank you so much for watching.